Hello everyone. Welcome to part 1 in our new unit, the Progressive Era. Over the course of this unit, we will review the problems of the era, which began with the industrialization of the United States, the people and groups that were responsible for making changes, and finally, what those changes looked like. In this lesson, we will focus on reviewing the social and economic problems of the era created by industrialization. The United States was busy, both at home and abroad, during this time, as the events in this unit take place simultaneously with the imperialism we studied last unit. As you are taking notes, be sure to include the information that helps you answer this essential question. What social and economic problems existed in this time period that progressives would seek to solve? If you'll recall, the problems facing Americans largely fell into 3 distinct categories. First and foremost, industrialization led to many problems for the everyday American. While the leaders of industry were getting rich, most everyone else was struggling with low wages, long work hours, and dangerous working conditions. Secondary to that was the effect that immigration had on society. As jobs were plentiful, immigrants came from many countries in search of a new life. But the United States was not prepared with the necessary supports and infrastructure. Lastly, political corruption abounded in this time period as politicians attempted to take advantage of every opportunity to seize more power and money for themselves. So let's talk about industrialization again for a moment. Remember, this was the first time in our history that the United States dealt with business on a nationwide scale, so it was all uncharted territory. One of the biggest problems facing Americans during industrialization were unsafe working conditions. There were no regulations determining what was considered an acceptable work environment, so companies could do things like lock workers in so that they couldn't take unscheduled breaks. As a result, though, when something happened, the workers couldn't escape. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory caught fire, and most of its largely women and children employees died, unable to escape. Other unethical business practices existed, and were all centered around helping businesses increase their power and wealth. For one, companies attempted to control their entire market through trusts and monopolies, which allowed them to control their prices. They also required workers to work 12 to 15-hour days, 6 to 7 days a week, for very little compensation. Workers didn't have other options, so they were forced to accept these conditions. And it wasn't just the adults with these problems. Most poor families sent their children to work as young as 6 or 7 to help support the family. These children were also working long hours for even less pay than their parents. Lastly, as industrialization was new, nobody had ever considered the impact that all of these factories would have on the environment, but we began to see an immediate negative impact on air and water quality. Another factor of industrialization was immigration. People came to the United States in droves for the hope of opportunity and a better life. We certainly had the jobs available to accommodate the influx of people. However, we did not have the infrastructure or support systems necessary. There wasn't nearly enough housing in the urban cities, and this led to multiple families crowding into single-family homes and what would become tenements and ghettos. There also weren't social supports in place to help with all of the other aspects of transitioning to a new country and culture. The discomfort caused by overcrowding led to increased prejudice and discrimination by American citizens who believed that their struggles were directly caused by all of the new immigrants. This brought on things like the Chinese Exclusion Act and other general discrimination against many Jewish, Polish, Irish, and Italian immigrants who came to the United States in large numbers during this time period. Lastly, the United States saw increased political corruption in the form of spoils systems or cronyism. In these systems, politicians rewarded their friends and family for their loyalty with appointments to public offices where they would have influence on government decisions and spending. This led to the rise of political machines, like the one controlled by Boss Tweed, who had New York City politics under his controlling hand. Here, government officials were only looking out for their own interests when creating policy and laws, and no one was looking out for the interests of the general public. Political corruption almost always led to greater social and economic struggles for the masses. So how do we fix things? The people who would ultimately bring all of these issues to light were called muckrakers. These people exposed established institutions and leaders as being corrupt through their newspapers and magazines. Muckrakers got their name from President Teddy Roosevelt, who compared their actions with stirring up mud from the bottom of the pond. Our first notable muckraker was Thomas Nast, the father of the American cartoon. We have talked about him before, and he was a cartoonist best known for his attacks on the political machine of William Boss Tweed in New York City. The cartoon on the left portrays Tweed as very large to symbolize his greed, in addition to his head being portrayed as a bag of money. Next up is Upton Sinclair. He was a writer and is best known for his expose on the meatpacking industry. He spent weeks researching and ultimately exposed the unsanitary conditions through his book, The Jungle. This would lead to government regulation of the entire food industry to ensure appropriate working conditions and that the food was edible and safe for the population to eat. Jacob Riis was a photographer who wanted the wealthy to stop ignoring the deplorable conditions that immigrants and other poor families lived in. He published a photo book, How the Other Half Lives, which included photos he took in the tenements and ghettos of New York City, depicting what life was like for New York's poorest families. Ida Tarbell was another writer, and she is best known for her work for McClure magazine, in which she published a 19-part expose over several years on Rockefeller's business practices with Standard Oil. Tarbell exposed the company as a monopoly, which ultimately led to Standard Oil being ordered to be broken into 34 smaller companies. Robert La Follette is our only muckraker in a position of political power. He was the Republican governor of Wisconsin at the time and would go on to become a U.S. Senator. During his tenure in public office, La Follette advocated for reforms like railroad regulation, worker protections, and the direct election of senators. All right, it's time to take a moment to reflect on our essential question for this lesson. What social and economic problems existed in this time period that progressives would seek to solve? You should be able to respond with 3 general categories as well as more specific descriptions for each.